Well, good afternoon and welcome to AIEC Webinar Weeks. This is the third webinar for this week, and today will be the last day for the year of our Webinar Week series. We look forward to hopefully starting this up again in January. We do ask that, please drop us a line if this is something that you enjoy, or if you have suggestions for future topics. We would definitely love to hear from you and make sure that we include those. Also, please be on the lookout in the next week or so. Actually, we'll be sending out some surveys just to get some more feedback. Please take a few minutes and fill those out for us, and you could be entered in the drawing to win some prizes. So a couple housekeeping items before we get started. This presentation is going to last around 45 minutes. We'll leave time at the end for some questions. As always, please remember to submit those questions to AIEC. You can select the drop down and send those directly to us. We will moderate those for our presenters today. We ask that, feel free to send those questions in. We will hold those till the end for this particular webinar series, our webinar, and we'll present those at the appropriate time. Please keep your microphones muted unless our presenters open up the floor, then feel free at that time to go ahead and unmute yourself. Brian, how can we get PE credits?
If you have not already done so, just shoot me an email, badams@aiec.coop. If you are looking for PE credits, most of you on the call, I think, have already let me know. So if you've already done so, you don't need to. But if you haven't, just shoot me an email so I can make sure to get you your PE credits after this is all over. And with that, we have two presenters today, Terry Viswanathan and Keith Schuyler. Terry is the lead economist in CoBank's Knowledge Exchange division, where she focuses on the energy industry, including the electric distribution, generation, and transmission sectors, as well as the rural water industry. A former attorney and professional energy economist with more than 2 decades of research experience working with global energy companies and government officials, Terry has served in a variety of capacities, from providing executive board level guidance to hands-on portfolio management of electric power units. Terry has a deep understanding of the evolving energy markets and has authored several publications on energy transition. Our second presenter today will be Keith Schuyler. Keith is a lead relationship manager in CoBank's Farm Credit Leasing business unit. Keith is responsible for working alongside CoBank lending relationship managers, serving electric distribution co-ops in 8 states in the Midwest. Additionally, Keith supports the lease financing needs of farm supply co-ops in 4 Midwestern states. I will also note that Aaron Johnson's on the call as well. So if you have any questions for any of those three, we'll be taking those. Just shoot those our way. We are going to probably touch on those at the end. So if your question doesn't get read immediately, we're just holding those till the end. So feel free to shoot those our way anytime. And with that, I'll hand it over to Terry.
Okay. Hey, good afternoon. We're in a slightly different time zone. We're out here in Denver. So I really appreciate having the group join us. I want to go ahead and see if we can forward on to the next slide. Okay. So, we're having this EV market update, and, really when thinking about the electric vehicle market and timing of why to have this conversation right now, I think it's an interesting moment, right? We've kind of all taken pause. Most of us are driving less this year than any year in the past. Several of us are officing from home. Our children might be remote learning. So by and large, it's a very different year. And so thinking about automobile market, it's just not the new normal. And so what we'd like to talk about in terms of today's discussion is, first, when we kind of step back and from an electric vehicle standpoint, how does it fit into our electric industry in terms of a trend that we're seeing, and where does it sort of fit? We want to go from sort of a macro picture down to kind of a micro level. So we're going to talk a little bit about where it fits with regard to the electric industry, and then focus on globally, where does the US fit with regard to electric vehicle adoption? Where do we stand? How does COVID impact where we stand in terms of this trend? And then we'll really get into the more micro, take a look at the regional trends with regard to adoption. What's moving the needle on adoption? What does it mean to your state in particular? And then what I want to do is really kind of talk about what I think is one of the most important events in 2020, which is this latest announcement that Tesla made about a $25,000 car. That's an important development. We'll talk about sort of why. First, that kind of big macro view. When we think about the kind of 4 disruptive trends for the US electric industry, you know, it's interesting, over a century, and yet a lot of these really disruptive events are occurring now. So, you know, I appreciate the fact that you sitting in your seat day to day, you know, we're actually dealing with a lot of change and understanding how that's going to impact the way we do business, the way we conduct our industry, I think is really important. As I mentioned, electric vehicle adoption is simply one of a myriad. There are 4 major disruptive trends that I think are important that need to be on our radar screen. Decarbonization, it's interlinked with electrification and EV adoption, but decarbonization, taking a look at our energy resources, making sure that they are low or zero carbon. That's the largest push we've had over the past decade. The digitalization, that's a really important trend. When we think about connectivity, making sure that in terms of the energy use we do have, we're smart about it, it's optimally used, making sure we're optimally connected. And then decentralization. You know, this is a really interesting area. About a decade ago, or less than a decade ago, about 75% of our costs in terms of energy generation were really about just that, generating the energy. Right now, there's been a pretty profound shift when we think about how we've done these central planned stations that are largely remote from most of our population centers. Many of these, 70% of the grid right now is at end of life. It's 25 years or older. Decentralization is largely coming about for several reasons, but one of it simply cost. Taking a look at the costs, you know, back in the early 90s, $2 billion was spent annually on just maintaining our transportation and distribution system. Now it's about $24 billion that are spent. So we've really seen a step change with regard to industry spending. That means when we think about generation and transmission, you know, about half of the cost is generation and about half the cost right now is transmission. For our rural electric cooperatives, there's a different sort of shift where, you know, even more of that spend is actually in just transportation and distribution. And then lastly, electrification and EV adoption, a relatively important development that is really interlinked to all of this, and that's where we're going to spend our time today. Backing up and taking a look at this global trend, and I think this is important, what you see is really this trend started back around 2015. As of 2019, we had a relatively important level in terms of vehicle passenger adoption. So we actually hit a 2 million mark globally for new sales of EV vehicles, and that compares to 75 million new cars that were sold in 2019, a high watermark. When we think about that, it's about 2.5% of all new vehicles in 2019, a high watermark, were electric vehicles. Where were they sold? Well, about half of those were actually sold in China. So of the little over 2 million, you've got about 1.1 million sales that occurred in China alone, about 600,000 in Europe, and about 300,000 occurred in the United States. Taking a look on a go-forward basis as we kind of look out through, you know, what we think to be the outlook, Bloomberg New Energy tells us that in 2040, what we're going to see is we're going to see a shift. So we're going to see now, you know, almost, 55 million cars. New sales are going to be electric vehicle. So a relatively important switch in terms of new cars. When we think about how many cars are on the road, so we're looking at about 1.6 billion cars on the road. How many of those are electric vehicles? Well, it's about a third. It's about 500 million that are going to be electric vehicles. In terms of regional distribution, you're going to see about half of the cars operating in Europe and about half operating in China are going to be electric vehicles. In the US, the estimates are going to be about 30%, or roughly the global average. You can see the composite too when you take a look at the right hand of that screen in terms of the graphics, in terms of how it plays out. Now, the interesting story here is that when we think about growth over the last 5 years, global auto ownership has been increasing. So new car sales have been increasing at a pace of 3.6% every year for the past 5 years. Between now and 2030, it's going to slow down to about 2%. Most important happens to be what's occurring right now. So COVID is a massive disruptor in terms of the macroeconomic picture. The macroeconomic picture and the economies are not faring well. That means there's simply less purchasing power. Less purchasing power means there's going to be less car purchases, and it will likely impact not only this year, but perhaps 2021 as well. As we think about 2022, kind of that year of recovery, it's a really interesting trend. So remember, I mentioned that China is going to, or has purchased about 1.1 million vehicles, electric vehicles in 2019, that high watermark. The conservative projections show a doubling, about 2.2 million will be sold into China. That's the lower estimate. The upper estimate is closer to 4 million. If we think about Europe, Europe is going to rise from about 600,000 vehicles upward to lowest estimates are 1.6, upward estimates of 2.4. And then the United States, 300,000 sold, a little over 300,000 sold in 2019, moving up at the lowest conservative stance at about 400,000, and the higher level about 1 million. Let's take a look a little closer at the US market as a standalone. Right now we have data coming in. On the right-hand side, it shows you the first half of 2020, and it compares to what occurred in 2019, a much slower outlook. And then we take a look at what's occurring now. If we think about the numbers, roughly 2% of our vehicles that are sold every year happen to be electric vehicles. We had a pretty important increase coming out of 2017, and that increase that occurred into 2019. When we think about what's happened in the COVID effect, it's pretty pronounced, particularly in a large market. China represents about half of the vehicles that have been sold. Taking a look at China, for the first half of the year, we achieved roughly half the pace or half the sales that occurred in 2019. Europe, in fact, is the only region where we actually see a pull ahead occurring. So in Europe, about this time, when we took a look at the 2019 data for the first half of the year, we noticed in 2019 about 263,000 vehicles have been sold. This year, fast forward, you've got about 414,000. Now, what's really important here happens to be the incentives. So Europe and Asia in particular see the economic stimulus packages clearly including a green stimulus package. So in Europe, you've seen a number of incentives include more subsidies for electric vehicles. Let me give you an example of that. In Germany, and it's probably the richest subsidy we're seeing so far, Germany will pay for $10,000 of your cost for your new car. And it's making a tremendous impact in terms of adoption and getting the cost of ownership down. I want to focus a little closer in on our discussion for the US. When we take a look at adoption, I thought this was a really helpful slide. It was provided by IHS Markit. We take a look at the electric vehicle share, and you look at cities like San Jose. Now, San Jose happens to be the epicenter where a lot of new electric vehicles are actually being purchased. And in fact, in San Jose, California, you've got 20% of new auto sales are actually electric vehicles. Other areas are also as hot. The western states, however, you're definitely seeing a pull ahead. A lot of this is occurring for several reasons, but states like Seattle, Portland, in the south in Texas, you've got Austin. We also have on the East Coast, you've got Hartford, Connecticut. You're seeing New York City, Washington, D.C. All of these have some commonalities. One is in 2019, there were roughly 29 vehicles on the market, electric vehicles on the market. In areas where we see high adoption rates, you're going to see a large amount of vehicle selection. So you've got in the 5 hottest regions, you actually see 25 different cars that are offered up. So if you go to a dealership, you have about 25 different options. The rest of the country at best has maybe 12 options, roughly half of that. And then other parts are just, how many charging stations. So in terms of charging stations, you've got about 450 charging stations per 1 million in population in these high dense areas of high adoption. And that's relatively important. On the right-hand side, in terms of what we're adopting, we kind of break it into two camps. One are battery electric vehicles. Those are traditional electric vehicles. They don't have an alternative. And then the plug-in hybrids. Right now, in terms of the share in 2019, 70% of your plug-in vehicles were battery only, standalone only, 70%. 30%, however, were those plug-in hybrids. One change in terms of how we think that market will look like going forward, as we see a rise in infrastructure, we also think we're going to see a relatively important change with regard to adoption, where you're going to see about 90% of the new vehicles being battery only, standalone. Let's focus a little bit more on what's important. So you're going to go ahead and buy a vehicle. What's important to you? Well, it kind of depends on who you are. There was a really interesting, so every year we have an electric vehicle adoption, what's important, and we kind of lump all the buyers into one category. And I think that's a mistake. Frankly, there are folks that are going to be more open to adoption, and they have certain preferences and certain requirements, and that's one way to kind of split the population. But what I really like, and what Castrol Motor Oil did in their EV survey that came out earlier this year, happens to lump into two types of camps. One is just you're a consumer for a passenger vehicle, and that's what you're going to consume. So just your normal residential consumer, what do you look like? And then the other is they polled fleet managers. And I think that's really important because that can move the needle in terms of adoption. And it just so happens they have two different set of requirements. On the consumer side, what was really important, 38% said, hey, it's about the upfront costs. Now we know in terms of maintaining a car, there's one with electric vehicles, the dollar per gallon equivalent, if you will, is about half what we pay for a gasoline car. So it's about half, about $1.24 compared to when DOE did this, Department of Energy did this a couple of years ago, about $2.64. It's $1.26 for an electric vehicle in terms of the equivalent for what you pay in terms of your fuel, if you will. And so it's about half what you pay. But there's also an important consideration, which is maintenance. Those things like timing belt, changing your oil, well, that's just not a consideration for electric vehicle. However, you have to get over the most important hurdle, which is what am I paying for this car? And it just so happens that by and large consumers, it's really that sticker shock that is the most important barrier to adoption. Next, of course, is going to be the charging time. How long does it take me to actually charge my vehicle so I can use it? That's a really important consideration. 27% said that was a sticking point. 20% talked about range. The range of the vehicle was a real concern with regard to being able to, how much do I get for my charge once I do charge the vehicle? And then other considerations, lesser considerations, in fact, is about half the considerations. The longer I can drive, the less concerned I'm going to be about the infrastructure. So how many recharging stations are in my area? Remember, high adoption rates, 450 per 1 million. And then I think last happened to be is what kind of vehicle am I going to drive? So this is where the consumers sort of fell out in that poll. The fleet managers, and this was really, really fun. First and foremost was what's the driving range? That was super important with regard to fleet managers. They tend to see more mileage. So range was a number one consideration, 34% said this would be a sticking issue. The vehicle type, now this was interesting. Vehicle type was also really important, but these fleet managers buy from certain OEMs. So that was a more important consideration. Infrastructure, 20%. And then the price, that initial sticker price, was less of a consideration for the fleet managers than it was for a consumer. And then lastly was the charge time. So really interesting way to kind of take a look, two different camps, two different considerations, or two different set of considerations, and they came out very differently with what was priority. Okay, taking a look at this though, when it really gets down to the rubber hits the road, I'm so sorry I used that, but you guys are all on mute, so you can't even complain. But what was really important? Well, first in terms of cost, the average vehicle cost $36,800 in 2019. So you know what? they want to see an electric vehicle that at least is at parity. So about $36,000, that's sort of the entry point in terms of where their interests lie. Charging time. I want to be able to charge in about 30 minutes. It's kind of the amount of time it's going to take to get a meal. If I'm having a meal out, the time I want to actually charge my vehicle. And then driving range. I've converted this from kilometers into miles, but about 290. So between 200 and 300 miles, that's really what I want. So this is kind of nirvana. And we're nearly there. So when we think about the cost, what was really important here is that there are about 10 battery, our battery plugins that were actually, 10 vehicle types that were actually under 36,000. Important to note, 13 of the plug-in hybrids were actually under this 36,000. But by and large, the average cost for an electric vehicle has come down considerably from 2018 to 2019. It was $64,000. Now remember, electric vehicles predominantly were sold in the luxury category. They continue to actually sell into that particular crowd. They have come down, really important change, where about $55,000 was the average vehicle cost, mostly because the adoption of the Tesla Model 3, a lower priced vehicle. The dominance in adoption actually moved the needle in terms of the average cost, but still, much above, you've got about, at least $20,000 above the average US vehicle. Some really important parts in terms of vehicle cost. I think the right-hand side of the slide, that sort of makes it clear. Back in 2016, about half of your cost for your vehicle was based on the battery. Now that is reducing down, and about 2025, it's going to be about half the cost of what it was back in 2020 or 2016. However, it's still an important component. By 2030, according to Bloomberg New Energy, you're going to get to a point where it's only 18% of your overall cost. Some real stickiness with regard to the vehicle costs, the powertrain, things that just don't move. But they said, nirvana in terms of parity is going to occur roughly about the midpoint. 2025, you're going to get to a point where you're going to pay the same amount for an internal combustion engine, a gas vehicle, compared to your electric vehicle, and that's going to be relatively important. The key driver here is going to be the battery costs. In terms of getting getting the price down, what's really important here happens to be subsidies. In the top 5 regions in the US where we actually saw a more profound acquisition, you had subsidies that were anywhere from $3,000 up to $5,000, the incentive, and that was relatively important. So $2,000 to $5,000 in terms of the uptake, that was a relatively important change. When we take a look at this in terms of policy, well, transportation now is the #1 problem with regard to greenhouse gas emissions. It is going to be a relatively important part of the Biden platform coming in terms of executive orders. And in fact, Biden has already announced he would like to have over 500,000 charging stations installed by 2030. So pretty big proposal. That would be a massive change. But even now, we see the gap in terms of infrastructure requirements will likely fill that gap by 2025. So even without federal policy, we're kind of getting to where we need to go. Most important part, however, is that battery costs. So I thought was really an important sort of announcement happened to be on Tesla's Battery Day. They met with press and rolled out some pretty, I think pretty bold plans. So, if we think about the average cost, what does it mean to consumers if we roll out a $25,000 electric car? Well, it certainly will move the needle. It's no longer at parity. It's at something that actually may entice buyers, especially because it's the #1 sticking point. But how are they going to get there? Let's do the math on Tesla's $25,000 electric car. Well, first and foremost, even if we shrink the battery costs, importantly, we're going to actually have to decrease the cost of that vehicle. So in terms of the frame, there's a lot of moving parts here, but we'll focus on battery. So battery right now, you're looking at in terms of a battery pack, cost right now for the average car is about $10,000 to $12,000. The changes that were introduced in September suggest the number is going to come down to about $6,000, and by about 2025 or between 2025 and the next 3 years, relatively important development. How are they going to get there? Well, one, is just taking a look at the battery itself, reducing the cost down, getting to that magic $100 per kilowatt hour, really relatively important mark. How do they do that? First, they focus in on factory. Factory changes are going to be relatively important in terms of process. They will also factor in, if we take a look at differences in materials, all told, they look at a 56% decline, and that's going to move the needle. The introduction, however, we've got to kind of, hold your enthusiasm, because back in 2012, Tesla did announce that the Tesla Model 3 would cost $30,000. As it stands right now, it's about $37,000. That's the cheapest version. If you want a longer drive, it's about $46,000. The more expensive Model 3 is about $54,000. So we're nowhere close to where they projected back in 2012. So we'll wait and see. But I think if we do get there, $25,000, well, that's meaningful, and we should see adoption. But the other important part of this story, and I think this is interesting, it's a very busy slide. It only kind of dawns on me now that this is a ridiculously difficult slide. But remember, right now, we're about 2% of new sales happen to be sort of market adoption, right? Well, what we've noticed with new technology is once we get to kind of 5%, that's a really important liftoff in terms of actually seeing the entire nation begin to adopt this standard. And I think it's interesting and thought-provoking. But when you think about what we're talking about, as soon as we introduced the telephone, well, we got to 5% and everyone adopted it. As soon as we introduced the radio, the refrigerator, the clothes washer, dryer, dishwasher, air conditioning, color TV, computer, and all of a sudden you get to 5% and we're off to the races. We get to 100% adoption very quickly, well within a 5-year time frame after hitting that important mark. And guys, we're already at 2%, so get ready. The only problem with this analysis happens to be is that substitution, right? When I think about dishwashers, easy substitution. My son's doing remote learning, so he can't hear this, but my substitution is having my son do the dishes. But in his mind, that's not substitution. It's not a pure substitution. So it's interesting is that when we think about this, if you're not going to drive an electric vehicle, are you back to a horse and buggy? Well, no, there's actually the gasoline car that's still available. So I think substitution is an important story, but it is thought-provoking. You're already at 2%. We get to 5%. If that comes around 2025, all of a sudden, do we start to see 60% of new car sales occurring? Maybe, maybe not. What's really important here happens to be, and keep a close eye on this, happens to be the regulations. In the state of California, you're not going to be able to buy an internal combustion engine in the 2030s. It's just not going to occur. So make your last purchase this time, because 10 years from now, that normal time that we actually go and buy a new car, well, it's going to have to be an electric vehicle if you're living in the state of California. It looks like New Jersey might also take up the same sort of movement. And there are 13 countries that you're not going to be able to buy a gasoline engine for passenger vehicle between the 2030s and 2040s. That policy, I think, will be more important. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, and he can take it from here. So wait with me, and I'll go ahead and change over control. Okay, Keith, I think you can take it away.
Okay, I will see if I can get the slide to advance here. Went one too far. Thank you, Terry. Finally got the technical things right here. Appreciate it. We're going to take now what Terry has presented and take it from that 30,000 foot view down to kind of how we would live that out if there's interest in actually getting an EV vehicle, and where CoBank Farm Credit Leasing fits into the picture and how that would work. Today's agenda, the 4 things I want to focus on today are going to be how CoBank and our leasing division, Farm Credit Leasing, works with EVs as well as charging stations. And then also we'll touch very high level, just one slide on solar leasing. It's related to the EV vehicles in the sense that there's investment tax credits available there as well. And then also just touch on what are the most commonly leased assets in the electric distribution space, as well as just some high level comments on getting started with leasing. So where does Farm Credit Leasing fit in? All of you on the call are certainly familiar with CoBank. Farm Credit Leasing is a wholly owned subsidiary of CoBank, and many times that we get called CoBank Farm Credit Leasing, or FCL for short. Some of you are already doing leasing with Farm Credit Leasing, but just wanted you to know that we're one and the same company. Really, both entities are going to source financing or debt from the same venues in the market, but the Farm Credit Leasing side is just going to package that up in a little bit different way that's unique in the leasing space. And as it relates to electric vehicles, the key advantage there is going to be the fact that Farm Credit Leasing and CoBank can take advantage of the tax credits that are available in the marketplace, whereas an ED co-op, if you were to go purchase one, being a tax exempt entity, you would not be able to take advantage of those tax credits. So we'll get into a more specific example here in a little bit as to how that works out. But as far as EV vehicles and the program at large, we have that managed through a special group within our division called Fleet Partner. And this Fleet Partner group would go out and either factory order an EV vehicle for your co-op and directly order that from the factory, or they can also work with a dealer and find that vehicle and then set you up with an EV vehicle lease that way as well. They do work with all the trade industry discounts and incentives, including the NRECA discount. So that is still taken advantage of to lower the cost of the vehicle. The EV vehicles the leasing is available to both taxable and non-taxable electric co-ops. So there may be some G&Ts on the call that are taxable, for example. Either way works with EV vehicles the way the tax rules are. And essentially, though, we take those federal tax credits and then we incorporate that into the pricing to the co-op as the lessee, and we'll get into an example of that. As far as the common ways that we structure those, typically they're going to be in that 3 to 5 year range with what we refer to as track residuals at the end. You could think of that as kind of like a balloon payment at the end of the lease. The structure of it, though, is going to be unlimited miles, so you don't need to worry about racking up a lot of miles and getting caught with any overage costs on that. And our asset management group would typically help us structure the leases with the correct residual, so you're not going to get upside down on the end and not have the value to support the residual that you're going to pay at the end of a track lease. We will keep it moving here. One of the things that Terry mentioned also is the Biden administration looking at really ramping up charging stations. And we recently made a decision as Farm Credit Leasing to go ahead and get into that space as well, and to be able to offer leasing in that for charging stations. So keep that in mind as you navigate forward in your community. If you start getting into that segment, that we are able to do that, and those would be set up on a 5-year lease term, and those would be set up with a dollar buyout residual. The key thing to remember there is that we would have a minimum of $20,000 to do a charging station lease. The one thing that we often get asked is, how do you secure those? And we would be secured simply by UCC fixture filing, and that would be what we would do from a security standpoint on charging stations. We're certainly starting to see them more in our area along the interstates. I'm in central Minnesota, and along I-94, you go to a Target, they're in the parking lot, et cetera. But that's how I'm seeing it in Minnesota, is certainly along the interstates. I'm starting to see them pop up more, and I think that'll become more aggressive over time in their placement. Next, just dialing down into a specific couple of vehicles that are commonly leased. This is a Chrysler Pacifica hybrid, and the one advantage, of course, and Terry pointed this out earlier, is the range. So the range on this particular vehicle is over 500 miles, and that certainly is important to a lot of people. And then you can see some of the charging data there as far as how long it would take to charge. And then in the pricing, the vehicle pricing itself, including the NRECA rebate, this particular vehicle right now would be right at that $41,000 mark for the vehicle. From a financing standpoint, where Farm Credit Leasing would come into play, that we would roll in, of course, the tax incentives. And this is really where kind of the main benefit is for an electric distribution or a G&T if they want to get into an EV vehicle, why you would lease it. And that is because CoBank, again, takes that tax credit and monetizes that and then passes it back through in the form of a lower lease payment. And in my 10 years at CoBank here, there's two times that or two assets that we've ever leased that have negative interest rates. And one is solar. In the past, when the investment tax credit was a little bit higher, it's going down now. But EV vehicles, this particular vehicle is at a negative 2.72% on a 3-year lease. So essentially, you would pay less at the end of that 3-year time frame than the initial cost of the vehicle. The next one that is commonly leased is the Nissan Leaf, and this would be, battery only, but you can see the range does go down to that 150 to 200 range, and then the charging statistics there are a little bit different than the prior vehicle. But one thing to point out is on the pricing, Terry had referenced that 36,000 mark as kind of that tipping point, and this would be an example. Although it's not a large car, it does get very close to that $36,000 mark that people have kind of that tipping point in their mind of when they feel like that adoption would start happening. And I'll be the first to admit, as a consumer, it seemed like a long ways off. And now I've told my kids and my wife recently, I said, it's not going to be that long before we will be driving electric vehicles, whether it's hybrid or all battery. So, from a financing standpoint on this one, this rate is actually a little bit more negative than the prior example at negative 2.95. And the reason for that is the way it's set up is each manufacturer has a certain amount of tax credits. And so as they sell their lineup of vehicles, that tax credit availability decreases. So this particular one has more tax credits available still, and therefore it ends up showing as a more negative effective rate. We often get asked, so hey, if we're going to take this step and get an EV vehicle for just publicity and education as a co-op, how do we make that known in the community? And this is an example of an excellent way to do that, and that's simply by putting your logo, or this is an example of actually just wrapping the car with the wrap, which is highly effective, good advertising, and certainly would encourage you to do that. If you're going to take this step, you may as well let the community know that's why you're taking it. It's just to help with that adoption process. The one caveat I have heard is I've never had a car with a wrap on it, but I've been told you don't want to go through a automatic car wash. So be careful from that standpoint, please. So this next slide is just a slide to kind of challenge myself and all of you, excuse me, to just really ask whether this is the future way out there, or is this today? I came from the great state of Illinois myself, grew up on a dairy and a hog farm in Fairbury, Illinois 30 years ago. My mom and dad live in Bloomington, Illinois, and my daughter just graduated from ISU in Bloomington, or Normal. And as I was heading back to Peoria about 2 months ago, I noticed the Mitsubishi plant there is being converted over to the Rivian plant, if I had air or not, if I saw the sign right. So it's here. It's happening. I think there was an announcement, I believe last year in May, that both Ford and Amazon had put about $500 million each into the Rivian project. So it's here. The upper left-hand corner is an example of a bus. Dakota Electric up in Minnesota here helped a school district get an electric bus. And that's a great use of electric. It's a known route that's similar every day. They know the range. And so that's an example, I think, where it's not necessarily the future, it's starting now. The upper right-hand corner is a delivery truck, and you've all seen probably the Amazon ads on TV, et cetera, where they're really dialing in on that option and trying to again get their fleet into electric options. And even in the agriculture space, I still have a tie to agriculture, and I see that happening as well on the horizon. But anyway, just a slide to kind of challenge us that is probably further down the track than a lot of us realize, including myself. And I think we need to somewhat get our heads wrapped around it and adapt to it. And the next slide really is that, just challenging us to think strategically about EVs and where they fit. You really think about it, there's always an adoption stage of whether, like in the 30s, whether it was washers and dryers, like Terry mentioned earlier, or the electric iron, somebody had to adopt and teach people how to use them. And as an ED co-op or a G&T, you're probably in a position where you're gonna have the best information or access to the best information about it, and will be looked upon in the community as an educator in this space. And so really this is just a slide to kind of say who's all in that circle that you could strategically partner with. Because I see days when there could be charging stations at lots of these venues that are listed in this circle, and charging stations, and therefore, and eventually it's monetized, and there's a monetary benefit as well in participating in that space. So it's just probably a slide to kind of percolate, you know, what's possible and who can you start integrating with in your community to talk about these things. I'm going to just go through a couple of other things here that are related to tax incentives, but not necessarily EV vehicles, and then we'll close it out and then have some time for questions as well. Solar is one of the things as well that we lease that has investment tax credits there, accessible. The one difference is, though, we would need a taxable subsidiary. It's different from EV vehicles in that sense. So a lot of times ED co-ops are not taxable, but they may have a taxable subsidiary, and that's normally who our lessee would be on a solar system. In that space, the rates are currently slightly positive, so they're above the 0%. Because of the ITC benefit, which you can see at the bottom, continues to decline from the 30% that it was prior. This slide here is just a reminder of what can be leased, and really you can look at the list, but really the first bullet point is going to be what I would suggest you dial in on. It's most of our leasing, a lot of it's going to be in the rolling stock. You know, their service trucks, bucket trucks, and pickups are going to be probably the most of what we lease, but we certainly have the appetite and ability to lease all of those assets on there. Really, about the only thing that can't be leased in our world is, like they say, if it flies, airplanes, if it floats, boats, or if it has fur on it, and that's animals. And so other than that, we can usually find a way at CoBank with our mission to find a way to provide lease financing. The most common, like I mentioned earlier, is bucket trucks. And this would be an example of a $300,000 bucket truck. Most of those are done on 7-year leases just to match the useful life of when they're for sure going to be used with the asset. And I know I'm going quick here and we're just about done, so hang in there. I want to leave time for questions, but this would be just give you a real high level example of a couple of different options. If you wanted a residual buyout at the end, or if you wanted the dollar buyout at the end, the rates are going to be in the low 2s at this point, just to give you an idea roughly where that would fall for fixed term debt. I'm going to go to the next slide here and to the last one here, just out of essence of time, to make sure that we have adequate time for questions. So just ideas for next steps. Going back to electric vehicles for a bit, if you have interest in getting into electric vehicle, you know, consider putting a logo on it. If you're going to do it, go ahead and tell people about it, and possibly demo it at some events and loan it out to members. The one question we do get asked often is, if you loan it out to members, you can blame Farm Credit Leasing in this sense, but it may help you. We would just ask for insurance reason that you don't loan it out overnight. And a lot of times the ED co-op would prefer to have that not happen anyway, but you can use us as the scapegoat if you need to. And then put information out there on your website and social media, just that you have that option and you're looking at it, because I think, as Terry referenced, we might be at a 2% now, but once we ramp up to 5%, and if that $36,000 target gets hit, it could ramp up quick. So now is the time to start dialing in on it and educating yourself about it. And then explore the charging station infrastructure in your community. Just look at, you know, what are the options? You know, who may have interest? Even to start talking with others in your community now, so you have a plan of what would be possible once that adoption ramps up, that you can be ahead of the curve on that. And then other ideas that have been thrown around is just, home installations for charging, as well as just on-bill financing, and then at least start thinking about time of use rates and how that structure would look when it can be monetized. And then, as we referenced earlier, solar, if there is interest there, certainly let Aaron know, and we can hook up on what would be possible and how that would work for any of you on the call. And then also, just from a vehicle standpoint as well, if there are needs out there, whether it's bucket trucks, pickups, etc., we'd have interest in visiting with you on that as well. So I believe I'm at the last slide here, yes, for information. And so I will end it there, and we'll turn it back over to the moderators for questions, should there be any.
Thank you, Keith. We have had a few questions come in throughout the presentation, so I'll just kind of go through those. I think the first couple will be for Terry. This first one was, you referenced Tesla. What does the current market share look like for car manufacturers?
Yes.
All right, looks like Terry might be off, so maybe we'll jump to some of Keith's questions.
Sorry, guys. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. So I said something really interesting and you missed all of it. But they, so, as you probably would think, Tesla Model 3 is going to be the top grossing sales of 111,000. It's about 38,000 vehicles, followed by the Tesla Model Y, that is going to be about 19,000. Model X, also Tesla, about 9,500. Following that, it's going to be the Chevy Bolt. That's about 8,370. The Nissan Leaf, also a very popular car, about 4,700 vehicles. But right now, the world is at least half the sales in the U.S. happen to be Tesla. So something we're quickly following. But as I think Keith mentioned, we're seeing vehicle adoption, especially in the fleet. There are different needs to meet different population groups. So you are seeing some variation there.
Another question that came in while you were presenting, Terry, how has COVID impacted EV sales this year, and will there be any lingering effect?
I think the real problem is the macroeconomic outlook. The fact is high unemployment, a tough look on the macro economy this year and possibly into next year means we have less purchasing power, and that's relatively important in terms of the outlook. So I think that 2020, 2021, you're going to see sort of dampened outlook for electric vehicles, but we've got to be super careful here. By 2022, we're back to the races. So very strong outlook occurring 2022. And I think, Keith, you mentioned, I think it's super important, begin to have a conversation. So Illinois is the fourth highest transportation state. So there's a lot of transit occurring within the state, a lot of transit occurring intra and interstate in terms of what's occurring. So I think it's important to have that conversation for your commercial, your hotels, your chains. A number of these are actually going to look toward vehicle adoption. So getting ahead of that, talking to your Walmart, your Target, and trying to figure out what the requirements will be within your territory. I think, Keith, that was excellent. Have that conversation now, because we want to be prepared, especially if we're out of the gate and we see kind of a boom in terms of taking off and adoption of electric vehicles.
All right, one last question for you, Terry. What policies might we expect under a new Biden administration?
Yeah, so I think there are going to be more incentives. So I think it's really important to understand you're going to see more incentives occur with regard to getting down that initial cost. That's the biggest obstacle, get that cost down. And I think there are going to be incentives, continued incentives in terms of encouraging EV adoption. So you can expect that out of the Biden administration. Also, you can expect to see more charging stations. So kind of really trying to hit both key obstacles to adoption. The Biden administration certainly is going to take a close look at hitting both.
Terry, a couple of questions for Keith. Do you have to be a current CoBank lending customer to do a leasing with farm credit leasing?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so the short answer is no. We do leasing with a number of co-ops that are not CoBank borrowers. So the one advantage probably of from a leasing perspective anyway, of being a CoBank borrower is we would set up what we call a lease line. So that would just anticipate what leasing needs would be for the next year. And it does provide some streamlined efficiency, but the answer is no. We can work with a co-op if they're not a CoBank borrower.
Another question for you, Keith. Currently, what are the most common electric vehicle models that are ordered by CoBank, Farm Credit Leasing, and Leased?
Yeah, absolutely. So the two that I had provided on the slide examples would be the two most common ones that are actually routed through leasing with CoBank, and that would be the Chrysler Pacifica and the Nissan Leaf. There was a number of Chevy Bolts as well, but as I referenced earlier in the presentation, there is a step down of how much of the tax credits are available as they sell their allotment of vehicles, and Chevy Bolt has already met that. So currently there's not any available tax credits for that particular vehicle.
One other question for you, Keith. Can a co-op locate an electric vehicle from a dealer and still lease it to capture the tax benefits versus having CoBank FCL order it from the manufacturer?
Yes, good question. Again, either way works. We can either source it and order it for the electric co-op, or if there's one found on a lot, whether that's found by the local co-op or by our group for the co-op, that also does work. We would just ask that we would then be the one purchasing the vehicle from the lot or the dealer rather than the co-op buying it and then doing a purchase lease back, because typically you're going to run into estates wanting to charge sales tax twice then, and we wouldn't want to do that. So the key would be let us step in once the deal's negotiated, for example, by the co-op with the dealer. Let us step in and actually have the invoice made out to Farm Credit Leasing and make the purchase.
Perfect. One final question for you, Keith. What are the typical lead times when ordering an electric vehicle?
Yeah, so that changes over time, but I did actually talk to our fleet partner group earlier this week, anticipating that question. And right now, the estimate that they provided me was 12 to 14 weeks would be what that would be at this time.
Well, Keith, I think that's all the questions that we have coming in right now. I want to say thank you so much for presenting for us today. It's a very interesting topic. Lots of good material in there. So we can't thank you enough. Thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure. A couple of reminders here. Don't forget, if you haven't had an opportunity to attend a webinar that you may have liked to but missed, you can visit our webpage, aiec.coop/webinar weeks. And we have a link to all of our previous or past webinars. Those are available for you to view. For today's webinars, it might take us a few days to get those uploaded, but stay tuned, they will be there. Also, again, please drop us a line, give us some feedback, tell us how you're liking these. We're always open to suggestions for future content. We'd really like to start this up again after the first of the year. And then finally, be on the lookout for a survey as well from Ashley. She'll be sending that out. And, if you got a couple minutes, take some time and fill that out for us, and we'll enter your name in the drawing to win some prizes. So with that, we have one more webinar coming up here at 2:30. So stay tuned. If you haven't had an opportunity to register for that, again, you can go out to aiec.coop/webinar weeks and register. If registration is not open, just email Ashley Graham at aiec.coop and she'll get you taken care of. And so with that, again, thank you to our presenters, Terry and Keith. It's been a pleasure.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you guys tuning in.
Thank you.